Hey everybody, Organized Biology here. Today we're going through respiratory and metabolic acidosis, and this is a complex topic sometimes. You get into a nursing program and you're still learning about it for the first time, and you're completely lost and you have no idea where to land. So if I were you, I would recommend watching this video first, get a background on acids and bases, and that'll help you understand the rest of it. So let's get rolling. So first off, acidosis. This means that our blood pH is below 7.35. So remember, blood pH needs to go from 7.35 to 7.45. And if we're too low, that means one of two things. We have too many hydrogen ions in our blood, or we have too little bicarbonate, because if we have too little bicarbonate, we're not going to be sweeping out as many hydrogen ions. So let's get started with respiratory acidosis. Now with respiratory acidosis, we're looking at one main molecule, and that is CO2. Now, why the heck am I saying CO2 when all I've talked about are hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions? Well, hear me out for a second. CO2, this is a byproduct of your cells when they're making energy. So all along your bloodstream, cells are making energy and they will spew out CO2 into the bloodstream. And that CO2, interestingly enough, in the bloodstream will combine with a very common molecule, water, and this will turn into what's called carbonic acid, which is H2CO3, again, carbonic acid. And if a word has acid in it, you can assume it does one thing. It adds hydrogen ions into the solution. So carbonic acid will add hydrogen ions into the solution. Now, if this is happening in the blood, we are going to lower the blood pH, potentially becoming acidotic. If you want more on this process, go ahead and watch Bohr effect. I highly recommend it. It talks about how acids are made from CO2. So remember, with this video, the more CO2 we've got, the more acid we will have. So, in normal functioning conditions, what do we need to do with this CO2 then? We're getting too acidic, right? Well, we need to breathe it out. Yep, and how do we breathe it out? We have our lungs. And in our lungs, we'll have tiny little air sacs that will be called alveoli, and they will kind of look like this. And when the carbon dioxide reaches the lungs in the bloodstream, it will actually passively flow out through diffusion, high to low, into the alveoli. Now, what do you do with the CO2 then? Well, obviously, you will breathe it out and exhale, therefore expelling the CO2 from your blood. What would that do to the pH? Well, if you're losing carbon dioxide through that process, it will actually bring the pH back up and make it normal again. So that's how the respiratory system actually plays with these hydrogen ion concentrations. But I'm telling you, there are some conditions where your respiratory system is contributing to the acidotic state. Now, how could that happen? Well, think about it. If we can't get rid of CO2 for some reason, where will the CO2 stay? In the bloodstream. And if the CO2 stays in the bloodstream, what also will stay in the bloodstream? Hydrogen ions, therefore making the blood acidic. So what could prevent us from getting CO2 out? Well, one thing primarily, and that is called hypoventilation. Hypo meaning low, ventilation meaning breathing rate. So we have a low respiratory rate. We're not breathing enough. And if we're not breathing enough, we're not exhaling enough. If we're not exhaling enough, we're keeping CO2 and hydrogen ions in the blood. That makes it acidic. So what could cause us to hypoventilate? A couple different conditions that you may have heard of before. Number one being emphysema. Now, emphysema refers to the lack of the alveoli's ability to recoil back to where they want to go. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means that when you're breathing out, what do you think this air sac will do when you breathe out? Well, it'll likely compress and close up, right? But then when you breathe in, it'll stretch again, and then if they're elastic, they'll snap back, close very easily. But if they've lost that elasticity, well, now they can't close up, so you're going to struggle to breathe out. If you struggle to breathe out, you can't get the CO2 out as efficiently, and you could get acidosis. So very common with people with emphysema. The second thing is anybody who smokes. What smoking does is it actually throws a bunch of tar and other crap and chemicals into the alveoli, and it can actually get too thick. And if this membrane gets too thick with all these cells and crud, well, now the CO2, normally it was passing through a really thin layer of the alveolar cells. Well, now it's got a big thick layer to get through. So the diffusion of CO2 is going to be compromised. So therefore, less CO2 will leave because it's getting stuck. Therefore, stays in the bloodstream, makes you acidic. And the last thing is due to some sort of brainstem injury. Now, what's your brainstem? Well, your brainstem sits right below your brain, and it has what's called a respiratory center. This, interestingly, contains what's called pacemaker neurons that talk to your inspiratory, your breathing in muscles, as well as your expiratory, your breathing out muscles, in a coordinated pattern. So when you're not thinking about breathing, you're still breathing, right? That's because your brainstem took over for you. So if this gets damaged, therefore you're not going to get those signals as efficiently to the breathing muscle, so therefore you could have some hypoventilation. Now this by no means is an exhaustive list of all the things that could cause respiratory acidosis, but it's a good start. So that's how the respiratory system can make you acidotic if it's not functioning properly. So let's hop over to metabolic acidosis. In metabolic acidosis, this can occur in anywhere except the lungs. So any other structure that is making you acidotic that's not the lungs, it's going to be considered metabolic acidosis. Now in metabolic acidosis, we are going to primarily be looking at the molecule bicarbonate. Contrast that with the molecule CO2 we were looking at in the respiratory system. So we're going to look at bicarbonate. Now remember, if you're acidotic, what's happening to bicarbonate? Hint, hint. Too little bicarbonate, right? So we're losing bicarbonate. Well, how can we lose bicarbonate? I'm going to show you 3 different ways. Number 1 is actually in the digestive system. So let me draw the perfect stomach right now. Okay, what the heck is going on here? Well, a couple things. When you eat food, it goes down in the stomach, and the stomach is rich in hydrogen ions because it has what's called hydrochloric acid, which stands for HCl. And whenever it gets into solution, it's going to make hydrogen ions. So it's super acidic. Now, all of that fluid is actually going to pass into the first part of the small intestine, which is called the duodenum. And the duodenum does not like acid on it. It would literally burn to a crisp. So we need something to neutralize the acid. And that neutralization comes from the pancreas, which secretes what's called sodium bicarbonate into this space. So when that gets dumped into this small intestine's hole, it will basically dissolve into bicarbonate and sodium ions. And that bicarbonate, remember in the last video that I talked about, this is a molecular Swiffer duster. It's literally going to Swiffer up those hydrogen ions so that the lining of the intestines does not get damaged. Very important. So when we do that though, the pancreas just spews out a bunch of bicarbonate willy-nilly. So that bicarbonate will kind of accumulate in the duodenum. Now, I want to point out right now, where is this bicarbonate not? It's not in the bloodstream. The bloodstream is here. But right now, it's in the tube of your intestines. And where does that end up? Out as poop, right? So normally, what you do with all this excess bicarbonate is you reabsorb it. And that helps contribute to your slightly alkaline blood. So you'd stay at about 7.4 pH. But remember, we're talking acidosis. So we're losing bicarbonate. How could that happen in terms of the digestive system? If you're thinking what I'm thinking, this is not going to end well because it's going to literally come out your end, right? So think about this. What if you had something called diarrhea, where your stomach and your intestines are just spasming out and flushing everything out of them without ample time to absorb them? Well, in this case, you are going to lose all of these bicarbonate ions as feces, as poop. So if you're losing bicarbonate, remember, you become potentially acidotic. You get metabolic acidosis from this, from excessive diarrhea over time. So that's one way. The second way is through renal failure. Now, anytime you see renal, you know that it means kidneys. How many kidneys do you have? None, because they're adult knees now. Just kidding, you have 2. And you know that the kidneys are a filter for your blood, right? So if we zoom in on the kidneys, what we will see is we'll see a lining of cells called the tubular cells, and they will basically be lined up against the blood supply. So this would be called the lumen, or the open hole of the kidney tubes, and then this would be the bloodstream. So the goal of the kidneys is to filter out stuff that will eventually end up as urine, and then bring back good things into the blood. That's what a filter does, right? It keeps the good and gets rid of the bad. So what's happening here? Well, when the kidneys filter out some of your blood, there will be a pretty good concentration of bicarbonate ions in that filtrate. Now, the goal, remember, is to keep the good, and we want to keep the bicarbonate. So we're actually going to pull that back into the bloodstream. At the same time, exchanging any sort of acid into the tubule so that it can end up as urine. So you'll pee out some acid, reabsorb some of that bicarbonate, keeping that blood pH slightly alkaline. But if we are in renal failure, we are not filtering out enough stuff. So therefore, if we're not filtering this stuff out First off, we're not going to be losing as many hydrogen ions as urine. Secondly, we're going to keep that bicarbonate in the filtrate. That means we're going to pee out more bicarbonate and keep more hydrogen. What would that lead to? Metabolic acidosis, because we're losing bicarb and we are gaining potentially hydrogen ions, okay? So renal failure, anybody who has kidney failure, they likely have to go on dialysis. Main reason being they have toxin buildup and their blood is becoming too acidic. So they've got to filter that out. Awesome. Well, not awesome. I don't wish that on anybody. Last one, and potentially the most complex. We're going to talk about diabetic ketoacidosis. All right, a few things to break down here, so stick with me. Diabetics. Well, what can diabetics not do? Well, they either, type 1, cannot produce insulin, or if you're type 2, you have what's called insulin resistance, which means your insulin doesn't really work the way it once worked. Okay, so what does insulin actually do? Well, insulin is like a key, and that key actually unlocks the door for a very important molecule, glucose, to get into the cells. So this is glucose, and in order to get into the cells, we need that key of insulin, right? So why do we need glucose in the cells? Well, glucose, if you've watched any of my previous videos, if you take glucose, combine it with the oxygen that you breathe in, we can make what's called ATP. Very important energy currency molecule for your cell. If you haven't learned about it, check this out real fast. But anyway, we need glucose and oxygen to get into the cells to make energy, and insulin is a very key factor in that. But if you're not making insulin, or the insulin's not working properly, we know now that glucose can't get into the cells. The cells then can't make their ATP. If the cells can't make energy, you can guess what happens? They peter out and die. This is a problem, but your body is amazing, so it will compensate for it. So instead of using glucose as a fuel, we will begin using the following two macromolecules, which you know, lipids, which are fats, as well as proteins. So you'll start breaking down fats and proteins for energy instead of using glucose for energy. So what happens here? Well, when we break down lipids and proteins, we break them down into what's called fatty acids and amino acids. This is basically the base unit of both of them that can actually go into the bloodstream, get into the cells, and then feed the cells so that they can make energy. Do you notice something here? Well, with fatty acids and amino acids, both of them have the word acids in them, right? And if they're acids, we know that they add hydrogen ions into the solution, yes? So therefore, if we're adding hydrogen ions into the solution of blood, we will have acidosis. Now, why is it called ketoacidosis in terms of diabetics? Well, ketones are a byproduct of fatty acid metabolism. So whenever you use fatty acids to make energy, we must break them down into what's called ketones first to make that ATP. So therefore, ketones, as well as the amino acids, will build up, and now their byproducts will build up and thus make hydrogen ions, thus making your blood quite acidic. So that's respiratory and metabolic acidosis, but these are dangerous conditions, are they not? They could damage your body. So what will your body do about this? Well, it'll likely compensate. So if one is happening, the other may compensate for it. So maybe if the renal system screwed up, maybe the respiratory system will help it compensate for that. Now, in order to understand how that happens, we have to learn about the flip of both of these. There's a type of respiratory alkalosis and metabolic alkalosis, which you will see in the next video here.